Richard Nixon. He was elected president on a law and order campaign. He had spent his entire life, and I believe in conspiracy. Now, conspiracy. Adolf Hitler was a conspiracy theorist. I have read some conspiracy theory books, but sometimes they can do more harm than good. For instance, one pretty popular newsman recently said that the Newington massacre of 26 first and second graders in Newington, Connecticut never happened. He got kicked off of the internet, which I think he should have been. I mean, there's such a thing as free speech, but there's another thing is just plain, outright, irresponsible speech. But Richard Nixon believed that people were out to get him. He was strongly conspiratorial. And also, as the election of 1972 approached, Nixon saw his popularity declining. To build it up, he opened up diplomatic trade with China. I mean, he visited China, first president to do so. He sent Henry Kissinger on a secret trip to China to open up the door for Nixon to come. But, now, here's the story of Watergate. I saw the Watergate Hotel is huge. The Democrats had their national headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. McGovern was the obvious Democratic nominee at the time. This was June 1972, and McGovern had swept aside all opposition, and McGovern was running for president. And we found, essentially, there was a black man going around checking the doors. He was a security guard. He checked the doors, and he saw the door to the Democratic headquarters had some black tape on it, electrical tape. So he pulled the tape off, and locked the door, okay, like he was supposed to. Well, he came back, and these security guards don't keep the same route. They get a different route every time. Well, he came back sometime later and noticed, hey, I pulled the tape off, but there's black tape on that door again. Well, he did what he was supposed to do and called the police. The police were really, really busy that night. And here's the purpose of the black tape. The black tape was to defeat the lock and make sure the door could be easily slid open. If any of you know that much about locks, certain kind of locks can be defeated by putting tape on them. Now, Gordon Liddy has said since that putting more tape on that door after the security guard had pulled it off was the dumbest thing he ever did. But Gordon Liddy himself retaped the door to make sure it could be opened from the outside. They had a lookout looking for cops. If the cops came, they were going to run. But the cops were really busy that night in Washington. It was summertime. It was late spring, June 1972. The cops were, and all they could do was send two plainclothes detectives in an unmarked car. Didn't look like cops. The cops came to the door, saw the tape, so they were easily able to swing the door open, whipped out their service revolvers from behind under their coats. In those days, everybody in Washington wore a suit coat. So they whipped out their coats, and they heard some rumbling behind the desk, and they said, come out from there with your hands up. Come out from behind there. They expected to see 2 hands and some burglar trying to steal something, some masked burglar. Instead, 10 hands went up. And the bodies that followed the hands were all dressed in a suit and tie. Turned out the men were working for CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. They were not stealing anything. They were planting wiretaps, microphones, recording devices, listening devices. A wiretap is where you tap onto a telephone line to where you can hear every conversation that's going on. And of course, they were trying to secretly plant microphones and recording devices inside the McGovern headquarters. At first, nobody paid much attention, even though, obviously, I mean, the first thing you could think of was Nixon probably did this. I mean, these men were working for Nixon, or they had money on them. The money turned out to have the same serial numbers as money donated to CREEP. Nixon had an odd way of getting in. CREEP was the Committee to Re-elect the President. So, anyway, Gordon Liddy was one of the leaders. Well, for years, a couple years, it took 2 years for this thing to come to fruition. Nixon wound up, in spite of Watergate, McGovern proved to be inept. McGovern's vice president, the man he chose as vice president, was found out to have mental problems and have taken shock treatments. Your book doesn't mention this. Then McGovern promised $1,000 to everybody And he'd get that money by taking it from the rich and redistributing it among the poor. In those days, that did not go over well. And we have candidates doing the same thing, except they're promising everybody $1,000 a month, whether you work or not. All of you know what I think about that, so I won't comment any further. But anyway, McGovern appeared to be a very inept campaigner. It was later learned that Richard Nixon and his men had an operation going on called Operation Dirty Tricks. Operation Dirty Tricks was where they found everything they could wrong with McGovern, with all of the leading contenders, including Muskie and Humphrey. They told sex stories against Muskie's wife, and Muskie was moved to tears, and Muskie said the good woman has never done anything like that, done anything wrong. They told sexual irregularities on Hubert Humphrey, even though he hadn't done it. All to get a candidate who would be easy to whip, namely George McGovern. So Nixon was elected overwhelmingly. Then, right after the election, our first Apollo astronauts orbited the moon. And then shortly after that, the Vietnam War ended, we got a whole bunch of POWs home, and Nixon was on the top of the world. His downfall came rather suddenly. In January, the POWs came home. By March, the country was seriously calling for impeachment. Committees were formed. The Senate formed a Watergate Committee. The House formed a Watergate Committee. And again, the Watergate Committee in the House was led by Peter Rodino, and the Senate led by Sam Ervin. We heard those names. And Watergate, we heard Watergate all throughout 1973, 1974. Finally, in August of '74, Nixon was forced to resign. Here's a story. One of the persons who testified said that he had planted, at Nixon's request, tape recorders in the White House and microphones throughout the White House to record all conversation. The tape recorders would come on when the microphone picked up a sound. Well, the Supreme Court eventually ordered Nixon to release one of the tapes, and the tape proved that Nixon was involved in a cover-up from day 3, at least, after the break-in. Now, here's the sad part of the story, folk. To this day, we have never proven that anyone close to Nixon had any prior knowledge of the break-in. In other words, Nixon's buddies, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Mitchell and Dean, all of them, well, Dean is not dead yet, but Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman and Mitchell all went to their graves insisting they had no prior knowledge of the break-in, but they covered up, and here's this, to me, the sad part, they all covered up for a crime that they did not commit. But that, the cover-up, was what did them in. Haldeman and Ehrlichman went to jail. Dean went to jail for a time. Mitchell went to jail. Nixon was pardoned by next President Ford. He did not serve time in prison. Nixon had to resign in disgrace. All covering up. And what I think happened was these men all said they learned of the break-in when they turned the radio. I mean, these were top high government officials who Nixon lived in the White House, but these men worked in the White House. They would get up in the morning, and if the radio didn't wake them up, they'd turn the radio on right away and get the news. I mean, if I were chief of staff for the president, I'd probably want to listen to the news all the time myself. Anyway, Haldeman said he turned his radio on when we got up. Ehrlichman said the same thing. While he was shaving, he had his radio on, and Mitchell had his radio on, and Dean had his radio on, and they all learned of the break-in. What I think happened was Nixon probably thought, I bet Haldeman did this. And Haldeman thought, I guess Nixon probably did this. And Ehrlichman thought, I guess Nixon or Haldeman, one of them did this. And Dean thought, hey, it might have been Nixon, might have been Haldeman. So they all covered up in a pile for each other, and there was no need for the cover-up. They all went down in a pile. That's my take on it. Anyway, to me, later presidents have done things far worse and gotten away with it, but nevertheless, Nixon, after a long, drawn-out battle, had to resign. His vice president was found to have Spiro Agnew, by name. Spiro Agnew had to resign before Nixon did because Agnew was found to have received kickbacks. In other words, as governor of Maryland, Agnew would award a contract to a company, and this company would pay him to put money in his own pockets. This was proven. The case all sewed up while Agnew was vice president, and Agnew had to resign. That was he did a plea bargaining deal to where he would not have to go to prison, but he pled guilty to a lesser charge. And part of the deal was that he would resign as vice president. Nixon's administration goes down as being one of the most corrupt in history. Now, again, any of you, all of you probably heard about Nixon. Oh yeah, Nixon, if you ever ask which presidents were impeached, we've only had 2 presidents were impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Richard Nixon was not impeached. He would have been. As long as Richard Nixon knew, but Donald Trump knows, as long as he has 34 senators who will vote for him, he can't be impeached. He can be impeached, let me clarify. Impeachment is done by the House. So yeah, anyway, he can be impeached with just a simple majority go to the House. But the Senate declares guilty or not guilty. And Andrew Johnson was impeached by the House, but the Senate declared him not guilty. Bill Clinton was impeached by the House, but the Senate declared him not guilty. As for Richard Nixon, he was certain to have been impeached and removed, rather than go through that where he knew he would lose. After the tape was released, he knew he'd lose. He simply resigned and saved the country from going through the impeachment process. All right. Okay, we're going to take up here next time. Well, no, I'll go through, we'll have about 5 minutes. Yes.
I'm going to step out for the
Okay. Israel went to war with its neighbors, which are talking about in 1973. It's called the Yom Kippur War, when the Arab neighbors invaded Israel during Israel's holiday. Israel was not prepared. Nevertheless, Israel fought them off, and about the time Israel started winning, the Arab world sued for peace. The Yom Kippur War was the last major conflict, open war between Israel and its neighbors. And as a result, OPEC, the oil-producing exporting nations, began to raise their prices. And that's when gasoline went from 30 cents a gallon to 60 cents a gallon. Well, first it went to 45, then 55, then 60, then 75, then 80. In those days, we did not have the ability to tell the Arabs, we don't need your oil, leave it there. We had to depend on Arab oil. Now, the day we found a whole lot more oil in Alaska and in the Dakotas. Oil was discovered in Alaska. We ran an Alaska pipeline. Oil was discovered in the Dakotas, and our previous president would not let it be taken out because of environmental concerns, but our present president has allowed it. So we are completely energy independent today. We were not back in 1973, and gas prices went up, and there were long lines to gas pumps, which none of you people were old enough to remember. But at one time you had to wait in line 1.5 to 2 hours to get gas. As each person finished pumping, you'd go forward, and you ran a risk that the gas station might run out before you got to the front. Okay, a recession resulted. I mean, I've already mentioned that the 50s and 60s were prosperous. In the early 70s, our country had an economic downturn. And it became almost fashionable to admit that you were having economic problems, that you were poor. The recession occurred. All right,